The American West exists because of one simple assumption, that water will always flow. From Las Vegas to Los Angeles, from fields carved out of the desert to megacities of tens of millions, everything was built on the belief that the Colorado River would always be there to carry the entire system. But what happens when the river begins to run dry? As reservoirs fall to historic lows, Hoover Dam approaches dead pool. The water crisis is no longer a distant scenario. It is unfolding right before our eyes. While the United States struggles to cut back, delay, and buy more time, halfway around the world, Israel, a country that has never had a major river, chose a different path, creating water in order to survive. Today, Terran Works takes you from the Colorado River in the United States to Israel, confronting one of the biggest questions of the 21st century. Is water still a gift of nature, or has it become a choice that humanity must pay for? Let's begin. The United States is home to hundreds of thousands of rivers and streams spread across the continent. But within that vast network, the Colorado River occupies a very different position. Rising in the Rocky Mountains and flowing through the arid Southwest, the Colorado is neither the longest nor the most water-rich river. Yet for the American West, it is the core water supply. Today, the Colorado River provides water to roughly 40 million people. Stretching from inland cities to coastal metropolises, its flow irrigates agriculture, powers industry, and allows cities to exist in regions of desert that would otherwise be nearly uninhabitable. That dependence was built in the 20th century, when water was seen as a stable and almost limitless resource. The West grew up around a simple assumption: the river would always flow, and humanity's task was merely to control and distribute it. But this very assumption created the system's greatest vulnerability. A single river that accounts for less than 2% of America's freshwater now supports nearly 1/10 of the nation's population, along with an economy worth trillions of dollars. As long as the flow remained stable, that fragility stayed hidden. As the Colorado weakens, the limits of the system are immediately exposed. For decades, the Colorado River continued to flow strongly enough for the system to function. Reservoirs still held water, cities kept expanding, and warnings appeared only in scientific reports. But as the 21st century began, the anomalies could no longer be ignored. Water levels declined year after year. Scarcity was no longer an exception. It became a prolonged condition. After nearly 2 decades, the question was no longer whether there was a problem, but where the problem began. The answer lies upstream. Most of the Colorado River's water comes from snowpack in the Rocky Mountains. For centuries, this snow melted slowly through spring and summer, sustaining a steady flow downstream. But as temperatures rise, snowfall decreases, and what snow does fall melts earlier and faster. The water runs off and evaporates before it can replenish the river. Studies show that the Colorado's headwaters flow has now declined by nearly 1/3 compared to the 20th century average. When natural water supplies become unpredictable, humanity's instinctive response is to try to keep them under control. On the Colorado River, the clearest symbol of that mindset is Hoover Dam. Completed in the 1930s, the dam blocks the Colorado to create Lake Mead, transforming a volatile river into a water source that could be predicted and allocated according to plan. For decades, Hoover Dam was regarded as an engineering marvel. It generated electricity, protected the region from floods, and most importantly, created a sense of water security for the Southwest. Thanks to the massive reservoir behind it, cities were able to keep expanding, agriculture could thrive in the desert, and natural fluctuations upstream seemed to have been smoothed out. But that artificial stability concealed a crucial reality. Hoover Dam does not create water. It merely stores and distributes what the river brings. When upstream inflows began to decline, the dam could not compensate for the shortfall. It only delayed the experience of scarcity, while downstream demand continued to grow. The system built around Hoover Dam was designed for a stable river, not one in retreat. As the 21st century unfolded, the gap between the water that had been promised and the water actually flowing into the reservoir became increasingly obvious. And it is here that the limits of the idea of infrastructure-based control began to reveal themselves. When the Colorado River can no longer supply enough water to meet all of its promised commitments, the consequences ripple outward in a domino effect. Major reservoirs fall to record lows, exposing stark, white bathtub rings along the canyon walls. Downstream, the river often no longer reaches the sea. The delta ecosystem that existed for thousands of years has nearly vanished. Wetlands slowly die off, native fish disappear, and communities that depended on the river lose both their cultural foundation and their livelihoods. In cities, the impacts may seem more indirect at first, but they are no less serious. Water supplies are cut, costs rise, and the risk of power shortages from hydropower becomes a real threat. As groundwater is overdrawn to compensate, land subsides permanently, damaging infrastructure and undermining long-term agricultural potential. Most alarming of all is that none of these consequences are hypothetical anymore. They are happening piece by piece, while the system continues to struggle to maintain the status quo. When the Colorado River no longer has enough water, the system is forced to choose where the first cuts will be made. And that choice does not fall in the desert or on distant fields, but right in the backyards of cities. Instead of symbolic calls for conservation, authorities began to intervene directly in how water is used at the household level. Cash for grass programs emerged, paying residents to remove green lawns and replace them with gravel, drought-tolerant plants, or desert landscaping. In a short time, neighborhoods once uniformly green shifted to shades of gray and brown. The change was highly visible and deeply controversial because it struck at a familiar symbol of urban life in the American West. If cutting urban water use is the most visible solution, then paying farmers not to use water is a far more shocking step. Across major agricultural basins, authorities have begun signing contracts to buy back water rights in exchange for leaving farmland fallow for one or more growing seasons. Fields that once appeared lush and green from above now lie still and barren, not because of failure, but because they are being paid to stop. From a technical standpoint, this is one of the fastest ways to reduce water consumption at scale. A single decision in agriculture can save as much water as millions of households combined. But socially, it is a deeply contradictory solution. Who gets paid? Who is forced to cut back without compensation? And what happens to jobs, supply chains, and communities that depend on agricultural production? This measure reveals a system that has reached the point of having to buy time with cash. It is no longer about optimization, but about controlled contraction. When the most effective solution is to not produce, the question becomes not only how to save water, but how far the system can shrink before it is forced to change at its core. As solutions around the Colorado River in the United States increasingly revolve around cuts and buying time, a larger question begins to emerge. If a society can no longer rely on a weakening river, what is the alternative? Perhaps to find the answer, we must leave the American West and look toward a place that never had that privilege to begin with. Israel is a clear example of a country built under conditions of near-constant aridity. Rainfall is scarce and unevenly distributed, and there is no river large enough to serve as a foundation for long-term development. Unlike the Colorado, around which an entire system formed around an existing flow, Israel confronted water scarcity from the very starting point, before growth or expansion were even possible. That reality forced Israel to approach water in a fundamentally different way. Rather than gradually adjusting to nature, water was treated as a problem of engineering and governance to be solved proactively. The goal was not to wait for water to arrive, but to ensure that society would always have enough water to function, regardless of how natural conditions might change. From this framing, an entirely different water system emerged, one that does not rely on river flow, does not depend on climatic luck and is not built on the assumption that nature will always provide enough. Without a major river to exploit, Israel was forced to look for water in a place long considered unusable: the sea. Along the Mediterranean coast, a network of industrial-scale desalination plants was built, turning seawater into a stable supply for households and cities. Instead of relying on rainfall or natural river flows, Israel actively produces water according to its needs. The core technology used is reverse osmosis, in which seawater is pushed through high-pressure membranes to remove salt and impurities. The process itself is not new, but what sets Israel apart is the scale and the level of integration. These plants operate continuously and are directly connected to the national distribution system, allowing desalinated water to flow straight from the sea into urban taps. Today, the majority of Israel's domestic water comes from desalination, enough to decouple urban demand from climatic uncertainty. This creates a strategic buffer that allows the country to endure drought years without imposing widespread water cuts. However, desalination is not meant to fully replace nature. It serves as a stabilizing foundation that makes other water sources more flexible. The ability to produce water on demand has fundamentally changed how Israel plans its development. Cities no longer expand based on projected rainfall, but on the capacity of water infrastructure that can be sustained. The technologies Israel uses are no secret. Desalination, water reuse, and drip irrigation have all been studied by many countries. The fundamental difference between Israel and the Colorado River system lies not in technology, but in how water is perceived and governed. In Israel, water is not treated as a local resource or a historical right, but as a matter of national security. Key decisions about water are made at the central level, rather than being fragmented among states, local authorities, or interest groups. This reduces internal conflict and allows the system to respond quickly to climatic shifts. When supply changes, pricing, allocation, and usage priorities change with it. While the Colorado system is still struggling with commitments made a century ago, Israel operates on a different principle. Water is a finite asset, and every decision about its use must reflect that reality. That centralized and decisive approach does not stem from a belief that technology can solve everything for free. On the contrary, Israel understands very clearly that manufactured water always comes with real costs. Desalination is not a miracle. It consumes large amounts of energy, depends on high-tech infrastructure, and creates ecological impacts that cannot be ignored. From brine discharge into the sea to the carbon footprint of the entire system. For that reason, water in Israel is never treated as cheap. Prices reflect the true costs of production, treatment, and long-term risk. This is controversial, especially in a society where water is deeply tied to daily life and agriculture. But rather than concealing or postponing the issue, the system forces users to confront a simple reality. Every cubic meter of water has a concrete cost, and no one is entirely exempt. That transparency creates a crucial difference. Instead of building a system on the assumption that water will always be there, Israel operates on the opposite principle. Water exists only as long as society is willing to pay to sustain it. And it is this blunt acknowledgement that helps the system avoid promises beyond its capacity, promises that are now pushing many major river basins, including the Colorado, into deadlock. The stories of the Colorado River in the United States and of Israel are not about right or wrong. They are stories of choice. One system was built on the belief that nature would continue to provide enough water. The other was formed on the opposite assumption. As the climate changes, both are now confronting their limits. And the final question is not which model is better, but this: what price are we willing to pay to continue living with water? What do you think about this issue? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next journeys with Terran Works.